The classroom smelled faintly of pencil shavings and printer ink, the end-of-day quiet broken only by the shuffle of papers. Jamal Carter sat tall at his desk, sliding his neatly typed essay across the table to his English teacher. He had stayed up late for weeks, pouring himself into every sentence, revising paragraphs until the words finally matched the fire in his head. For once, he felt proud, not just of finishing, but of what he had created. The teacher skimmed the first page, her brow furrowing. Her lips pressed together in a thin line. She glanced down the page again, then back at Jamal. "This is polished," she said carefully. "Very polished." Jamal smiled nervously. "I worked really hard on it." Before she could respond, the classroom door opened, and Principal Edwards stepped in. His suit was crisp, his tie knotted tightly, his expression always a shade too stern. The teacher stood quickly, handing him Jamal's paper. "You'll want to see this," she whispered. Edwards scanned the essay, his eyes darting across the lines. But instead of admiration, suspicion sharpened his features. He lowered the paper slowly and fixed his gaze on Jamal. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Jamal frowned. I I wrote it, sir." The principal's tone hardened. "Don't play games with me. This essay isn't the work of a high school junior. The vocabulary, the structure, it's far beyond your level." Heat rushed to Jamal's face. "It is my work. I stayed up for weeks on it. Ask my mom." She saw me writing Edwards, slammed the essay down on the desk. The sound cracked through the room. A few students still lingering after class peeked in, startled. "Enough!" Edwards snapped. "This is plagiarism. You copied it from somewhere online, or had someone else write it for you. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise." The words hit Jamal like a blow. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His hands curled into fists under the desk, not from anger, but from the helplessness clawing at his chest. "I'm telling you the truth," he said finally, his voice shaking. But Edwards only shook his head, his expression set in stone. "No, Jamal. The truth is that you cheated, and there will be consequences." The essay that had once felt like his triumph now lay flat on the desk, transformed in the principal's eyes from proof of his talent into evidence of a crime he hadn't committed. And for the first time, Jamal realized his words alone weren't enough to defend him. The next morning, Jamal walked into school with his backpack slung over one shoulder, trying to carry himself like nothing was wrong. But he could feel it before he saw it, the shift in the air, the way whispers seemed to follow him down the hall. At his locker, two students leaned close, their voices sharp enough to cut. "That essay wasn't his." "No way." "Yeah, I heard the principal caught him cheating." Figures Jamal's stomach tightened. He slammed his locker shut a little harder than usual, but the sound only drew more stares. By the time he reached first period, the weight of suspicion was everywhere. His classmates looked at him differently, not as the quiet, hard-working kid they'd always known, but as if he were some kind of fraud. A few smirked openly. One girl whispered loud enough for him to hear, "Guess Google writes better essays than he does." Jamal sank into his seat, heat rising to his face. His teacher avoided his eyes, stacking papers neatly on her desk, like she wanted nothing to do with him. Then, the loudspeaker crackled. "Jamal Carter, report to the principal's office immediately." A chorus of oohs rippled through the room. Someone snickered. Jamal rose slowly, forcing his legs to move, even as his chest burned with humiliation. Every step to the door felt like a spotlight pressing down on him. In the office, Principal Edwards waited with the essay in hand. He waved it like a piece of damning evidence. "I told you, Jamal, this isn't your work. I've already spoken with your teachers, and frankly, they agree. You don't produce writing like this." Jamal's mouth went dry. "Because I tried harder this time. I wanted it to be perfect." But Edwards wasn't listening. He leaned back in his chair, his voice booming so loudly the secretary in the hallway could hear. "Perfect? Students like you don't suddenly become perfect. You cheated, and this school won't tolerate dishonesty." The words echoed down the hallway. By the time Jamal left the office, his peers already knew. Students crowded the hall, smirking and whispering as he walked by. The essay that had been his pride had now become a scarlet letter, and the humiliation stung worse than any failing grade ever could. The principal's office smelled faintly of coffee and stale carpet cleaner, but to Jamal, it felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. Principal Edwards sat behind his desk, the essay still in front of him like a piece of damning evidence. "I've reviewed this with multiple staff members," Edwards said, his voice flat, rehearsed, "and we're all in agreement. There's no way this is your original work. Therefore, you are suspended for academic dishonesty, effective immediately." The words hit like a stone to the chest. Jamal's mouth fell open. "Suspended?" "But I didn't." "Enough!" Edwards cut him off, his tone final. "You'll have 3 days out of school. Further violations will result in expulsion. Perhaps this will teach you that cheating has consequences." Jamal sat frozen, his fists clenched on his knees, the heat of injustice burning through him. It wasn't just that he was being punished. It was that no one would even listen. The door burst open. His mother, Denise Carter, strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. She had been called from work and still wore her scrubs, her hospital badge swinging at her chest. Her eyes blazed as they locked on the principal. "You suspended my son?" she demanded. Edwards rose stiffly, straightening his tie. "Mrs. Carter, your son submitted an essay far beyond his capabilities. It's obvious he copied it. We can't overlook something like this." Denise stepped closer, her voice low but dangerous. "Far beyond his capabilities? Do you hear yourself? My son reads every night, studies for hours, and writes until his fingers ache. And the first time his talent shines, you call it cheating?" Edwards bristled. "Mrs. Carter, please understand." "No," she snapped, slamming her palm down on the desk. "You understand. You are punishing him for being smart, for being better than you expected. And you want to put a stain on his record because you can't believe a black boy could write something brilliant." The secretary outside glanced nervously toward the open door. Students passing by slowed to hear. Denise pointed to the essay. "If you think my son didn't write this, then prove it. Don't hide behind assumptions. Let someone impartial read it. Let them decide." For the first time, Edwards hesitated. His authority cracked slightly under the force of her fury. Denise crossed her arms. "We want a hearing before the school board. You don't get to destroy my son's future without a fight." Jamal looked at her, relief and pride washing over him. For the first time since the nightmare began, he didn't feel completely alone. And though Edwards tried to keep his composure, a flicker of doubt crept into his eyes. Because Denise Carter wasn't going to let this end in silence. The school board meeting room smelled faintly of old paper and polish, its fluorescent lights buzzing above rows of plastic chairs. Jamal sat in the front with his mother, his essay clutched tightly in his hands. His stomach churned, not from guilt, but from the weight of being treated like a criminal for something he hadn't done. The room was packed. Teachers filled one row, whispering among themselves. A few students had slipped in, curious to watch the spectacle. And at the center table sat Principal Edwards, stiff-backed, his suit pressed, a folder of documents stacked neatly in front of him like weapons. A board member cleared his throat. "We are here to review the case of Jamal Carter, accused of academic dishonesty. Principal Edwards, you may begin." Edwards stood, his voice sharp and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, this essay," he held up a copy of Jamal's work, "is far beyond the typical ability of a junior student. The vocabulary, the analysis, the style. Frankly, it reads like the work of a graduate student. We believe Mr. Carter copied it from an outside source." The board members nodded, scribbling notes. Edwards pressed on, his words gaining force. "I've taught and overseen this school for years. Students like Jamal don't just produce work like this. It's simply not credible." Jamal's fists tightened around his own copy of the essay. The words cut deeper than he wanted to admit, not just because they doubted him, but because of what Edwards really meant. His mother leaned forward. "Excuse me," she interrupted sharply. "Are you saying students like Jamal? What exactly do you mean by that?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Edwards flushed but quickly smoothed his tone. I mean students who have not previously demonstrated this level of academic achievement. That's all Denise's glare could have cut steel, but the chair of the board silenced her with a raised hand. Thank you, Principal Edwards. Now we will hear from the independent evaluator. The door at the back opened, and an older man walked in, a retired professor with a stack of papers under his arm. His presence was calm but commanding, his reputation well known in the district. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a low, deliberate tone. I've been asked to review the essay in question, and I intend to read it aloud, in full, so that we may judge for ourselves. The room hushed instantly. Jamal's chest tightened, his pulse thundering in his ears. For weeks his words had been dismissed, doubted, twisted into lies. Now finally his voice, his real voice, was about to be heard. The retired professor, Judge Whitaker, adjusted his glasses and unfolded Jamal's essay with a deliberate care that commanded silence. He looked around the crowded room before speaking. I have reviewed this work, he said, his voice steady, and I will read it aloud, so we may all judge it on its merits. He cleared his throat and began. The first lines rolled off his tongue with a clarity that caught the room off guard. Vivid imagery, precise arguments, a rhythm that pulled the listener forward. Each sentence built upon the last, weaving evidence and emotion seamlessly. This wasn't a jumble of copied lines. It was alive. It breathed. Teachers who had entered with doubt shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Students leaned forward, eyes widening. Even board members, accustomed to droning reports and hollow excuses, found themselves captivated. Whitaker read on, his voice carrying Jamal's words with gravity. About resilience, about justice, about the overlooked power of young voices. The essay wasn't just polished, it was passionate. It bore the fingerprints of someone who had thought deeply, felt deeply, and dared to put that truth into writing. Halfway through, one teacher whispered to another, I've never heard a student write like this. Another responded quietly, because they never gave him the chance. When Whitaker finally reached the last paragraph, his voice softened. The conclusion rang through the room like a bell. Strong, defiant, unforgettable. He lowered the pages, his hand trembling slightly, not from age, but from the force of what he had just read. The silence that followed was thick, almost reverent. Then Whitaker looked directly at Jamal. These are not the words of a plagiarist, he said firmly. They are the words of a writer. They are the words of this young man. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some of the same students who had snickered the day before now looked stunned, ashamed. Teachers avoided Jamal's eyes, guilt heavy on their faces. Principal Edwards stiffened in his chair, his jaw tight, but the certainty he had worn like armor was beginning to crack. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jamal felt the room shift, not against him, but toward him. And for the first time, his voice had finally been heard. The silence after Judge Whitaker's reading felt heavier than any gavel strike. He set the papers down carefully as if they were something fragile and removed his glasses. His eyes, sharp despite his age, scanned the room until they landed on Jamal. This essay, he said, his voice deliberate, is not copied. I ran it through every plagiarism system available to me. Not a single line appears anywhere else. What I found instead was consistency. The same voice, the same style, the same depth, page after page. This is not the work of a cheater. This is the work of a gifted student. Murmurs swelled across the room. Teachers exchanged guilty glances, some shifting in their seats, as if the truth exposed more than Jamal's innocence. It revealed their own quickness to doubt. Jamal sat frozen, his chest tight. He wanted to speak, to shout that he had told them all along, but his mother's hand on his arm grounded him. He didn't need to gloat. The truth was speaking for him now. Whitaker wasn't finished. He turned to the school board, his tone harder. You suspended this boy because his work was too good? Since when is excellence a crime? Since when is talent treated as guilt? One board member cleared her throat, eyes downcast. We simply relied on the principal's judgment. Whitaker's gaze snapped to Principal Edwards. Then that judgment was clouded, perhaps by bias, perhaps by arrogance. Either way, it nearly cost this young man his future. Edwards flushed crimson. He opened his mouth to protest, but the weight of the judge's words and the eyes of the entire room crushed his defense before it could form. Denise Carter squeezed her son's hand tighter, pride burning through her anger. "I told you," she whispered. The truth always wins." Whitaker leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "This case is settled. Jamal Carter did not cheat. He excelled. And instead of punishment, he deserves recognition." A hush fell again, this time not from suspicion, but from shame. And in the quiet, Jamal finally lifted his head high, the doubt that had smothered him for days, falling away piece by piece. The room was still heavy with Judge Whitaker's words when the chair of the school board finally cleared her throat. "Given the evidence presented," she said carefully, "the suspension against Jamal Carter is hereby overturned. The record will show no wrongdoing." A murmur spread through the room. Some teachers nodded in relief. Others lowered their eyes, ashamed of how quickly they had doubted him. A few students whispered among themselves, but this time the tone wasn't mocking. It was awe. Jamal let out a slow breath, the kind that seemed to empty weeks of tension from his chest. His mother squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with pride. "I told you," she whispered softly. "Your voice matters." Principal Edwards sat rigid, his face tight with humiliation. For once, his booming authority was gone. He muttered something about procedures and miscommunication, but no one was listening anymore. The tide of the room had shifted completely. Judge Whitaker turned toward Jamal. "Young man," he said firmly, "you are a writer. Don't let anyone take that from you." Jamal nodded, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Thank you, sir. I never wanted trouble. I just wanted to be heard." The older veteran teacher in the back, the one who had stayed quiet throughout the hearing, finally spoke up. "We heard you, Jamal, and we'll remember." As the meeting adjourned, students who had once snickered now lingered, some offering shy words of encouragement. One teacher clapped Jamal gently on the shoulder, murmuring, "That essay was brilliant. Don't stop writing for Jamal." The victory wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about reclaiming his dignity, proving that his brilliance didn't need permission to exist. When he and his mother walked out into the evening air, the sky painted gold by the setting sun, he felt taller than he had in days. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't begged. He had let his words, his truth, speak for themselves. And finally, after being silenced and shamed, the world had listened.